Hello, second graders. Welcome to Read Aloud with me, Miss Taylor. We are going to read the next chapter from the 1001 Arabian Nights by Geraldine McCorcoran. And let's see, in the last chapter, on Tuesday, we read about Sinbad the Sailor. And Scheherazade survived her first night as King Shahryar's newest wife by telling him this story. And then she kind of stopped telling the story and said, "Well, it's time to go and get beheaded." And then the king was like, "Well, maybe I need to hear the rest of the story of Sinbad the Sailor." So her plan is working so far. Her plan to save her life, and she's also saving the lives of lots of other people by staying alive, by staying King Shahryar's wife. So this is chapter 3. This book has some cool illustrations. Chapter 3, Sinbad the Sailor, the Valley of Diamonds. So in the last chapter, remember Sinbad the Sailor, he was on an island that turned out to be a whale. And they set a little fire on the beach, and then the whale, jumped out of the water, dove out of the water, into the water, and all the sailors were like, "Ah!" And Sinbad was able to survive by kind of floating on a laundry basket, and then he came to a different island, had a big white dome, and he was like, "What's this strange building?" And then it turned out to be a gigantic bird's egg. Oh. So let's find out a little bit more about this huge bird. So the bird in the last chapter kind of blotted out the sun. It was so huge, blotted out the sun. Chapter 3, Sinbad the Sailor, the Valley of Diamonds. Ooh. On the next night, Scheherazade reclined on one elbow, rested her head in her hand, and continued the story of Sinbad the Sailor. From the well of my memory, I drew up the strange and wonderful tales I had heard at Baghdad harbor. I recalled travelers' descriptions of the giant ruck, a bird whose wingspan half covered the sky. It's a humongous bird. Undoubtedly, I was squatting in the shadow of just such a bird, and my only hope of life lay in staying hidden under the egg. This is Sinbad describing, I remember hearing about this giant bird called a ruck. And so he's kind of hiding under the egg. A vast, stinking warmth enveloped me as the ruck settled over her egg, and I found myself somewhere between the clawed feet, a pouch of bird down pressing on my head with all the weight of a feather bed. It pushed off my turban, it's like a hat, which unwound at my feet. That was when I formed my plan of escape. I wonder how he's going to escape from underneath this bird. Lying down alongside one horny talon, the claws, as thick and rough as a log, I tied myself securely to the ruck's claw. He's tying himself to the bird, using the cloth of my turban. So a turban is often like a bunch of cloth that's wound up to be like a hat. So he's unrolled his turban. He's tying himself to the bird. Then I went to sleep to escape the pains of fear in my heart and the pains of hunger in my stomach. I woke up in time only to wish that I had stayed asleep. The ruck had risen off its egg and was climbing a furlong with every beat of its wings. Furlong is like a long distance. The egg below soon looked no bigger than a white bean. The whole island soon looked no bigger than a pea. So the bird has carried him up into the sky. I wish to commend my life's good deeds to Allah, so that he might be merciful to me, but I could remember lamentably few. So he's like talking to God, like, my life. He's thinking about his life. He's thinking he's probably not going to survive. So I vowed to behave much better if Allah in his mercy would grant me the opportunity. Like, I'll be better tomorrow, God, please help me. Still the bird soared higher until I thought it must roost among the beams of the sun. The air was so thin that my lungs shriveled to the size of walnuts, and the blood abandoned my head. So he's getting dizzy. He's going so high up in the sky. I regained consciousness just as the rook swooped down below the rim of a black canyon and glided down into a valley. "Oh, Allah is truly merciful," I cried. It's kind of like, "Oh, thank you, God. He saved me from the gulf of the ocean and from the vault of the sky and has set my feet on solid ground again." Oh. Fumbling at the knots of cloth, I rolled away from under the ruck and bundled together my turban. So he's like untying himself from the bird. "Oh, Allah is full of subtlety," I shrieked. "Was a drowning too good for Sinbad, or starvation too merciful? Was it not bad enough to be eaten by the ruck? Was fate preserving me for this miserable pit?" For everywhere I looked were bare black rocks, and the sides of the canyon were sheer. Between every rock and strangling every boulder, huge black serpents coiled and writhed about. So he's in like this canyon, this valley, and there's black rocks all around, and there's a whole bunch of black serpents, like snakes. Ah. The ruck had brought me to this pit of despair, stretched out its grotesque head, and snatched up a serpent as though it were a wriggling worm. Then, with a scrabbling of gravel, it ran forwards and took off, spiraling up to the narrow blue slit of sky a mile above me. It scarcely interested me, but indeed it was not gravel which the ruck scuffed up. Everywhere, but everywhere, the ground was sprinkled with precious stones. Diamonds, emeralds, sapphires, and rubies. More treasure than even the greed of a young Sinbad had ever imagined. All kinds of jewels. And shall I tell you, friend, my only thoughts at seeing this undreamt of wealth? I wept because the diamonds hurt my feet to tread on. Normally you see all these gems and you would be like, "Oh, diamonds and rubies and emeralds, oh my." But he's like, "Oh, they hurt my feet." And he's thinking he's not going to survive. He's in this big canyon and it's like a mile up to reach the top of it. Those hideous land serpents rippled as hugely and shined as blackly as were as many as the swelling waves on a night sea. The roots of my soul shriveled, and I fell on my face waiting to be swallowed, strangled, or poisoned by their licking fangs. Just then, I tell no lies, but believe me if you can, a slab of raw meat fell on my head. A slab of raw meat, like a big hunk of like a steak or something. That's weird. A serpent is crawling over me, I thought, praying for a quick death. Just make it be quick. But as the juices trickled down through my hair, I decided that I was in fact wearing a side of mutton. That's like meat from a lamb. Perhaps it was a hint from Allah that I should eat hearty before I was eaten. So I crawled out from under the meat only to be narrowly missed by another side of mutton bouncing down the canyon wall. There's another big hunk of meat. Have you heard the rumor, friend, of a place called the Valley of Diamonds? Well, I can vouch that the place exists. There are indeed merchants who grow rich on the diamonds, but they dare not climb down among the snakes. Instead, they pitch slabs of raw meat into the ravine. So there's people who stand above the canyon, the ravine, and they throw big chunks of meat down. The diamonds and so forth become embedded in the meat, so they get stuck in the meat as it lands on them. Then the giant rucks, the big birds, hunting for food, fly down and carry the mutton out of the ravine. So the big birds fly down and catch the meat and bring it back up. Let my story tell you what happens next. When I realized what was happening, I gathered up as many jewels as my pocket would hold, crawled back under the slab of mutton, and clung to it as mortal man clings to life. So he gathered up a bunch of jewels and held on to the big piece of meat. I guess it's pretty big. A ruck came hunting for food to feed its chick. And I and my meat were lifted off the ground in the grip of its giant claws. So this bird is holding him because he is stuck to the meat. He's holding onto the meat. The giant bird is carrying him up. And soon the serpents in the valley looked no bigger than bloodworms in a barrel. It looked like worms because he's going higher. The bird carried its food to a nest in the crook of a mountain ledge. It immediately began tearing at the meat with its gruesome beak and pushing pieces into the pink gullet of its chick, a creature as big as a cow. This baby bird is as big as a cow. One peck slashed open my chest, and the next would certainly rip out my heart. "Oh, Allah!" I cried. "Did my mother's care and my father's money make me fit for nothing but to be breakfast to a baby rock?" Just at that moment, an avalanche of rocks tumbled past the ledge, and a great din of shouts and hoots up above frightened the rock off its nest. One solitary merchant lowered himself on a rope to the ledge and began prodding the meat. "There are no jewels there, my good fellow," I said. At the sound of my voice, the merchant leapt backwards. At the sight of me crawling from under the meat, he fell on his knees and began praying. It's like, "What are you doing?" I suppose I was not as clean on the day of my mother bore me, caked in sea salt and bird lime, and red from head to foot with meat, juices, and blood. Ooh. "Forgive me, friend," I said, "for I know that cleanliness is close to Allah's heart. But if you would be so good as to help me off this unpleasant ledge, I would willingly share with you the treasure whose weight so discourteously prevents me from getting to my feet." He's like, "Oh, I have a lot of jewels." So saying, I fainted, quite overcome with hunger, weariness, and pain. I received from the merchant the most precious of Allah's gift, hospitality. It's going to be nice and kind to him. He fed and cared for me and only grudgingly accepted half my immense riches. So this nice merchant is helping him, and in return he's giving him some of his diamonds and jewels and rubies and emeralds. He found me buyers for my diamonds, emeralds, sapphires, and rubies, and when I was fully recovered, he directed me to a coastal harbor where my newfound wealth bought not just one ship, but a whole fleet, like a whole group of ships he was able to buy with after trading in his jewels. Unfortunately, not one captain among those who sailed in and out of the harbor had heard tell of Baghdad. Imagine it, friend, that some of the islands of the world have drifted on the winds and tides so far from the world's center that the inhabitants have never heard of Baghdad. Baghdad was this really big city, kind of one of the centers of the Islamic Empire. It's like, they haven't even heard of it. I sent the fleet in all directions, one following the Dog Star, one the Pole Star, one the Pleiades, and one the Red Planet, with instructions to trade at every port until they found knowledge of Baghdad. I myself boarded the ship with the richest cargo, opened the sails fully, and ran before any and every wind. For who sends the wind but Allah? Who sends the wind but Allah? I crowed, sighting an island one morning. But the captain said, "Some devil sent this one," and he bent his head onto the wheel and wrung his hands. He ordered the sails to be reefed in, and the ship turned to put the island behind us. But no sooner had we turned than a pirate ship rushed down to us. We lay between the ship and shore with not an inch of sail blowing. The captain recognized both the island and the approaching ship, and he cursed his fate for bringing him to these waters. I begged him to tell us why he was lying full length, beating the deck with his fists. The captain's very upset. I begged him to tell us what to expect, but he only moaned pitifully and said, "Expect death, young man. Expect to die." So the captain is just like, "Oh dear, look where we're going. We're doomed." "Oh, but what am I thinking of?" said Scheherazade, breaking off suddenly. "I have told you the story of the first voyage of Sinbad, and now I presume on your patience to tell you the awful events of the second voyage." "Oh, don't interrupt the story with your chattering," said King Shahryar. "Go on, go on." "But your courtiers are knocking on the door, my most eminent and conscientious lord, and I still owe you your rightful wedding present, my little head on a silver dish." She's like, "Remember, you need to cut off my head, right?" "Oh, worthless woman," said Shahryar, stamping out the chamber door. Opening it, he shouted at his startled chancellor, "Do you know the story of the second voyage of Sinbad the Sailor?" The chancellor fell on his face in the doorway and kissed the carpet between the king's bare feet. "Oh, forgive me, my most powerful and intellectual lord, but I cannot truthfully say that I do." "You see," said King Shahryar, turning to his wife, "are you suggesting that I go without the second voyage of Sinbad, rather than keep my own headsman waiting? I forbid you to leave this room until I have come back tonight and heard the story." "O patient and even-tempered husband," said Scheherazade, "forgive my lack of judgment, for I am only young and foolish. To hear you is to obey." King Shahryar dusted his hands together with satisfaction and strode downstairs to his audience chamber while, outside in the courtyard, the old wazir walked fretfully up and down and the royal swordsman sharpened his sword. So that is the end of this chapter. So Scheherazade has survived another night, and her plan is working. So she keeps telling a story and then saying, "But then, oh goodness, you know what happened next? Oh, we're out of time. It's time for me to go." And King Shahryar is like, "Wait. Okay, you will remain alive one more night so I can hear the next story." So, will her plan continue to work? We'll have to wait to find out. Until next week. Bye, second graders.